Hi everybody. So for this week's video, this will be my last video with somebody kind of related to narcissism. Um, and then I'm going to move on to a new topic and criminals that are, um, related to that mental illness, whether they were diagnosed with it or had traits of it. But today we're going to finish with Jim Jones. Um, so he's the guy that was kind of the head of Jonestown, which was something that happened in the 70s, later 70s, and it was considered one of the largest case of mass murder, intentional murder of American citizens in some sort of terror attack um, until the events of 9/11. And so but Jim Jones, who, like I said, was the guy that really was the mastermind behind this, he had a really, really kind of a roller coaster of a life. Because so much happened with him, from a really young age, and just leading up to Jonestown, it was crazy. And now, mind you, just because somebody has, a tough life, a tough upbringing, that does not excuse them becoming a criminal or them having bad behavior. That should never lead somebody to a life of crime or a life of violence. For him, it did. Ultimately, it led to having multiple affairs on his wife, using drugs, alcohol, and in some perspectives, kind of losing some grip on reality. And it kind of blows your mind what all happened leading up to Jonestown. So Jim was born in May of 1931 in Crete, Indiana, to James and Lynette Jones. So Jim's dad was named Jim as well. It doesn't really, my sources didn't tell me what his mom did. But she was kind of more of a free-spirited person. She didn't really want children. She was more of a free-spirited person. She didn't really believe in religion. She did work, but never found any information on like what sort of jobs she held. And his dad was a disabled veteran. He had been disabled in a chemical attack during World War One, and his father's disability, the lung disability because of the chemical attack, caused a lot of financial difficulties for the family from even before Jim was born. There was a lot of issues with finances because Jim's dad couldn't work, or his options were at least limited to what he was able to do. So in 1934, when Jim was about 3, they were actually evicted from the family home because they failed to pay their mortgage payments. Because, like I said, Jim's mom was working, but women at the time could only make so much. And Jim's dad was on disability, and again, that only paid so much. And this was during the Depression, so the government treasury had essentially crashed, so they were still in that time of recovering. And so relatives of the family, extended family, actually purchased them a kind of rundown shack still in Indiana, not far from where they were living to begin with. but the biggest thing was it lacked plumbing and electricity. So they had no running water, no lights to turn on. They would have had to live by candlelight, essentially. And they attempted to earn some level of income by farming the land that they had, but they were unsuccessful with that. And Jim's father's health just continued to worsen and worsen during that time. And it was very common for the family to not have adequate food, and they very much relied on financial support from their extended family. And they would actually kind of do a gather. They had a gatherer mentality where they would just go into the woods and forage, essentially. So like finding mushrooms and berries and stuff, things like that, to really supplement the little that they had. And a local woman, Myrtle Kennedy, she was actually the wife of a local church pastor, developed a level of attachment to Jim because she kind of knew his situation, and just really wanted to try and support him any way that she could. So she actually gave him a Bible and encouraged him to, read it, study it, and taught him kind of the holiness code of the church that she went to. So that was kind of his start in religion, from a very, very young age. So probably like elementary school age is when that started. And he attended church services with Myrtle. And as he got older, he would attend a few different church services a week. And in multiple churches, he was actually baptized. So he was baptized multiple times into multiple religions. His mom, at the time he kind of developed the idea that he wanted to be a pastor or a preacher when he finally got done with school and everything. But his mom was actually kind of disturbed with him going to church as often as he did, because like I said, she was not somebody that really believed in religion, didn't really believe in God at all. But she caught him imitating a local pastor and didn't really like that, was not comfortable with him doing that. So attempted to stop him from going to the different church services. So around that same time, kind of growing up and being very low class, because his parents didn't really have an income of any sort. Of course, he was local around the neighborhood, but his neighbors reported that he was a very odd child. They were kind of disturbed by him, because he was very obsessed with religion, very obsessed with death, and actually social doctrines. Later on in his life, Jones actually stated that he was ready to kill by around the third grade, so around 8 years old. And he admitted that he was very aggressive and hostile at the time, and that he wanted to kill. And he felt really unloved, especially by his parents, because his mom, like I said, she didn't want kids, and his dad was very distant. So he didn't really get much attention at home. The only person that really gave him any attention or affection was the pastor's wife, Myrtle. And some of his peers noticed, so people around his own age, that he always carried a Bible around. They weren't really sure why he always carried a Bible around, because, for a lot of people at the time, You might have Bible study sometime during the week and then church on Sundays. But he was obsessed with it all the time. It was a 100% of the time thing for him. So people just saw that as odd. And something that I'll kind of discuss a little bit later, as we get into more him kind of developing his church, the People's Temple. While he was in high school, he was at a local baseball game, and there was a lot of racism happening against the other team, because I believe the other team was either a team made up of all black players, or there were a lot of black players on the team. It didn't really say, but he saw the hostility that other people were giving to those players, and he's like, that, what the hell's going on? That's not cool. So that's where he kind of started developing the idea of, why do we segregate? What's the reason? I don't like it. I'm against this. He really started developing the feelings of being against racism, which will come up later, like I said, when he starts developing the People's Temple. So his parents ultimately divorced when he was 14, in 1945. And he he stayed with his mom. He did not stay with his dad. And because of the divorce, the family that was supporting them financially were no longer supporting his mom. So because of that, because they were in a very tight financial situation, Jim actually went to work at Reed Hospital. And he was well regarded by the senior management there. He was kind of one of those all-around helpers. I'd say more kind of equivalent to kind of what a CNA does, where they kind of do a lot of all-around work. They assist the nurses and the doctors with, transferring patients, helping patients get cleaned up, that sort of stuff. He was kind of an all-around person. So he was very well regarded by the senior management, but some of his coworkers and other staff members said that Jim was really had some disturbing behaviors towards some of the patients and some of his coworkers. And they felt very uncomfortable with him. And that's actually where while working there, he actually met his wife, Marceline. So they dated for a couple of years. And then Jim went to college while Marceline was working as a nurse. And then actually during that time, because Marceline thought that Jim was a Christian, and Jim never really identified as a Christian. So that began a lot of arguments, because they didn't really see eye to eye on a lot of aspects of their religion. And then they eventually did compromise about at least some of their views on religion, and they decided on a church to go to. So they kept going to that church while Jim was in college and Marceline was working. So then finally, after I believe 5 years, Jim earned a degree in secondary education from Butler University. And after that, in 1952, so he was about 21 at this time, he became a Methodist minister, and he had some communistic views. He believed, everybody should be treated equally. And, he believed in a lot of communistic ideals. So people saw him as a communist. And a lot of people in the local community didn't really think that a minister should be considered a communist, but he was still allowed to become a minister. So then in 1954, he was actually fired from his position as a minister at the Methodist church that he was working at because he was being accused of stealing church funds. But he claimed that it was because church leaders forbade him from desegregating the congregation. So it's still kind of up in the air of, why did he leave? But he was let go from that position. And during the time that he was a minister, and for about a year after, he was holding what he called healing sessions at the Pentecostal Assemblies of God churches. So this was between 1953 and 1955. And he started very small. He would start with headaches and coughs, and then progressively as time went on, he would ultimately move up, and the scale of, how extreme is he able to do these healing sessions, which I'll talk about again in a little bit. So then after he was fired from that Methodist church, he actually began associating with, it's called the Independent Assemblies of God churches, that they essentially embraced the latter rain movement. And they were actually, they had very few requirements for somebody to become an ordained minister with them. And they were actually very supportive of anybody who wanted to do the divine healing practices like Jim had already started doing. So then in 1956, so about 2 years after being dismissed as a Methodist minister, he became an ordained minister with the IAOG. And then he started hosting healing conventions in June of 1956. And this is where he kind of started escalating things from, like I said, starting with like coughs, headaches, to being able to cure more serious illnesses. And during this time, while he was doing these divine healings, he was actually dramatically increasing the attendance of these churches because people actually believed that he could heal them. And he actually got a ton of support from the African American communities because of his views on desegregating the churches. He really wanted to have everybody there, no matter your race, how you identify, whatever. He wanted you there, and he wanted your support. So, like I said, during this time, him and Marceline were married, and they ultimately decided to adopt several children. And they only ended up having one biological child. The rest were all, there were a couple white children that they adopted, but most of them were children of color. And in 1961, so this was well over a decade before Jonestown really was a thing, he started warning his congregation in Indiana that he was getting visions of nuclear attacks that would devastate Indianapolis. And his wife actually confided in some of her friends that he was becoming very paranoid and very fearful. So this is kind of, in a matter of speaking, kind of the where things really start to escalate, with him wanting a lot of attention, him being like, oh, I'm having these visions and you need to listen to me because shit's gonna happen and shit's going down. And then in 1962, he started believing that South America was going to be the best place to go to uh, relocate his church and really would be the safest place. So he started traveling to researching places like Brazil and Guyana for the perfect location for the People's Temple. And so he actually left. He traveled to Brazil and Guyana for a couple of years with his family in search of this perfect location. And actually, during his absence, the attendance of the People's Temple, it dramatically dropped because he wasn't there doing his healings. It actually shrunk to under 100 people, where there had been a couple hundred at the time before that. And the church was actually going into massive debt supporting his mission to find the perfect location for the People's Temple. So then in 1963, he had been gone for around a year at this point. The interim head of the church sent word to Jim while he was in South America of the essential collapse of the church and told him, if you don't come back, I'm leaving. I'm not going to continue this if you're not here to support what you started. And so then he did return with his family, and because of the massive amount of debt, they sold the building that they were in Indianapolis, and then they started to be able to get more money again for the People's Temple. Jim actually started doing the healing seminars again. So in 1964, Jim started going to California to find a new location for the People's Temple, a better location. And ultimately, he decided on the Redwood Valley. That would be the best location in California. So in 1965, him and his family relocated to the Redwood Valley area and opened up a church there. And about 140 members of the People's Temple followed from Indiana to California. They all relocated themselves. And while he was there to continue making money to support the People's Temple, to buy this location and everything, and to be able to sort of support his family, he actually got a position in Ukiah as a government and history teacher. And because of that position, he was actually able to directly influence people to join the People's Temple. So then by 1969, the People's Temple had increased their numbers yet again to about 300 people. And at this time, he had started doing healing seminars again in California. He'd only been doing them really in Indiana. So then he started doing them again. And he was doing, like I said, he started again with the, healing the headaches and the coughs and the kind of more minor things. But then he would increase to actually have undercover people that knew that, his healing was a fraud. They would actually help him, and they would sit in the audience, and he would essentially call on them and say, oh, you have this cancer that you're not aware of, cough it up. And they would actually cough up a piece of like chicken liver or chicken gizzard. And, they would hold it in their hand and be like, I coughed up the cancer. When, like I said, it was just organ meat. But the other people, they knew no better. They didn't know that these people were kind of in on the fraud. So then around this same time, Jones actually started using illicit drugs, which, so like stuff like opioids, which just skyrocketed the amount of paranoia that he already was dealing with. This was kind of the noted dramatic increase of that. So he used to feel control, and then he used it to manipulate his followers. And his enemies had kind of changed over time. The enemies of the church, they had gone from like KKK because he was desegregating his church, and the KKK didn't like that, to, oh, now it's Nazis that are against us. And then now it's rednecks and their guns and they don't like us. To finally, it was the government. The government's against us and they're spying on us and they're trying to shut us down, all that stuff during the 60s and the 70s. Which was not necessarily an uncommon thing. You hear the stories about people being against the government because, you got to give it to the man. And he soon, because of this, because of the amount of paranoia he was dealing with, he actually started controlling almost every aspect of his members' lives. Because he's like, I need to make sure that these people aren't giving out too much information about what we're doing here. So then he expected them to give over all of their assets, all their money, houses, everything to the church, spend all of their time there. Everything that they sold and gave to the church would go, towards their room and board. And members that worked outside of the People's Temple had to give all their money to the church to help support them. And members that rebelled, that were like, no, we're not going to do that, were actually punished. They were isolated from other members. They were reduced food rations. They were actually given harder work, public ridicule, humiliation, and actually there was times where it led to violence. So in 1971, a few years before everything happened in Guyana with Jonestown, that's when he really started getting a lot of negative press. And reporters started covering his divine interventions and divine healings. And he was actually investigated at one point in 1972 by the Indiana State Board of Psychology, because they were really concerned that he actually believed what he was doing, which he may have believed what he was doing was actually working. But, of course, the Board of Psychiatry was very concerned about this. They didn't like it. And then in 1973, there were allegations of abuse to temple members, which was happening. That is a reported fact that abuse was happening. And Jim was actually arrested for allegations of masturbating in the presence of an undercover LAPD officer. But eventually the charges were dropped. They didn't have enough evidence against Jim to hold him. Unfortunately, had they, had enough evidence, none of this stuff really would have happened. So then, with the amount of paranoia increasing with Jim, and of course the drugs were not helping, in 1974, the land was actually purchased in Guyana for the start of the development of Jonestown. So then, stuff started getting developed a little bit more. Plans were being set more in stone for Jonestown to really be built. And then in 1977, 50 settlers went down to expand Jonestown, but it was not nearly ready enough for the vast amount of people that were going to be moving down there in such a short time. In total, over 900 people moved down to Jonestown that year. And there wasn't enough space for them. At one point, they were sustaining themselves off of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and water. And if there he would occasionally reward like good behavior and good productivity with a single cookie once a week. And of course, every night he would have these long rants and give these long sermons to the people until 10, 11 at night while they were down there. And during this time, to support Jonestown financially, of course, Jonestown was getting Social Security money from people that were able to receive it. That was one way they were financing it. But the people of Jonestown were actually making toys that were being sold in the capital. And that, of course, made minuscule amounts of money, but that's how they were doing it. That's how they were able to afford anything. So then in 1978, so about a year after people had started moving down there, concerned family members of the people that were in Jonestown started addressing Congress actually about what was happening. Excuse me. And of course, during this time, Jones was becoming increasingly paranoid about an impending attack from the U.S. and told his people at the time that they needed to drink poison to prevent the suffering and capture of everybody that was there. And that he actually did that at one point where he had told people, hey, I've got these barrels of poison, you need to drink it. It was not poison. It actually was just Kool-Aid, or I guess Flavor Aid was what they were able to get down there. It was a cheaper option of Kool-Aid. And so finally he was like, yeah, I made you drink nothing. That was just a test to see who's actually loyal to me. And apparently a lot of people were not upset about that. For some reason, that didn't bother them. So that same year, mainly because of the concerned relatives, Congressman Leo Ryan actually visited, and the members that wanted to leave actually addressed him. So at the time, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. During this time, if people wanted to leave Jonestown, they essentially had to pay out of pocket to get out of there, to buy a plane ticket or a boat ticket to get out. And all of their passports were actually locked up in Jim Jones's cabin. So they would have to pay him directly to A, get their passport, and then B, for a way to get home. And because all the money that they were making was going directly to Jim, nobody could really do that. So then Leo Ryan in 1978, he went down and visited, and some of the members of Jonestown were like, hey, we want out, but we're not able to get out. Can you help us? And so he's like, yeah, get in the back of the truck. I'll take you guys with me. So then they left, and a security force that Jim had started actually followed them to the airstrip and killed all the members that were attempting to leave and Leo Ryan himself. So they were all dead, and Jim started his sermon saying, hey, these people are all, they were going to go back to the U.S. They were going to try and kill all of us and all this stuff, and of course spreading lies. So then November of 1978 was when Jim finally was like, I can give you guys an escape. The U.S. is closing in on us. I can give you guys a peaceful death. I can make sure that there's what he claimed, I can make sure that there's no enslavement of the children. They won't murder the elderly. This is your way out, essentially. So at this point, he had everybody either drink poison. There was some evidence that they found later on of people being injected with poison, the people that didn't want to drink it. And then Jim himself and a couple of his mistresses were found shot to the with shots in their head. And so that was kind of how it all ended. The Guyanese government had actually found them a few days later. They couldn't super accurately tell how long they'd been dead because of the heat and the humidity. The decomposition had really kind of ravaged their bodies, and it made identifying the victims very difficult. There were some ways with old dental records, but there was a large amount of people that were never able to be identified, and who were never claimed by their families, if they still had family left alive at that time. And so there's actually a donated piece of land for a mass grave in, I believe, Oakland, California, for the victims of the Jonestown Massacre. And a total of 909 people died. And this was the largest loss of American life in a deliberate act until the events of September 11th in 2001. So this was a massive, just him. And there was some stuff that I kind of skipped over. This was more of just a basic timeline. But he, during the time where he was really trying to ramp up his, healings and his desegregation, it was a lot of it was really, I want you to focus all of your attention on me. You need to do what I tell you, or, think bad things are going to happen to you because you're not doing what I tell you. I'm the Messiah sort of idea, which is very difficult to process, as somebody from the outside looking in. So there's a lot that I know personally I would never be able to understand of why people chose to follow him, why people believed what he was saying. Like I said, there's just stuff that I personally will never understand. And I don't necessarily really want to understand it because in my mind, following somebody like that is very twisted, and it blows my mind whenever I think about it. So if you guys have any questions or comments or anything, feel free to put those down in the comments. I will be posting one video in the description of another YouTuber who does a video on Jim Jones and the Jonestown Massacre, and she covers a lot of stuff that I didn't cover, that I just kind of maybe glossed over a little bit. And she has a lot of very good information as well. So definitely check out her channel too.